So wonderful to have you all here. Welcome to all of those watching. My name is Robert Baines. I am the President and CEO of the NATO Association of Canada, a charitable nonprofit dedicated to informing Canadians about the value of security and the importance of NATO. This is something that most Canadians do not consider, and that is a bit of a flaw. It's a great thing that we don't really have to worry about our security that much, but it's something that we should all pay attention to, because Canadians cannot just blithely ignore what's going on in the rest of the world. It does affect us. Canada, as a middle power, needs to be more ingrained in the rules-based international order, and the support of that order is our foreign policy goal number one. NATO is a wonderful organization that's at the center of that order. It is a very simple organization that has said one thing: an attack upon one is an attack upon all. Collective security is the way to maintain peace and strength. As part of that, the NATO Association tries to reach out and discuss all sorts of international instances, international events. NordStream 2 is a big event in Europe, and it affects our security tremendously. That's why we're thrilled to talk about that here today with a wonderful panel. And to usher us through this discussion, we have the Senior Fellow of the NATO Association of Canada, Dr. Robert Cutler. He's been educated at MIT and the University of Michigan for his PhD. He's also had about 20 years in the energy security discussion space. He has worked with energy companies, with different institutions. He's also a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, in addition to the NATO Association. He's somebody who's intimately aware of all of the issues and is the perfect person to usher us through this discussion. Dr. Cutler, please take us away.
Yes, thank you, Robert. It's a pleasure as Director of the Energy Security Program at NAOC, to welcome everybody to yet another panel on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And we will have three panelists, including myself. I regret to say that within the last 24 hours, both Alan Riley and Agata Osko-Stratkota had unexpected family medical emergencies that required their immediate attention and continuing attention, and therefore we are graced with the presence only of Dr. Maria Shagina, who is a fellow at the research fellow at the East Europe Center for East European Studies at the University of Zurich. And congratulations, Maria has been appointed a visiting fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. I will also be pinch hitting in the batting order, lead off batter. Robert Baines has already given you my introduction, and our other panelist is my good friend Andreas Umland, who is a well-known expert on Ukraine, and will be discussing, his affiliation is with the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And there we have it. The way that this will unfold is the following. I will begin with some background, about 6 minutes or so, concerning the context and the history of Russian energy relations with Europe, from Spitsbergen to Sicily, and from Brest in France to Brest in Lithuania. Concerning the relations, these relations over time, in order to contextualize the remarks that first Andreas and then Maria will make on their respective topics, which are, for Andreas, the German-Russian dependencies, including with a focus on the energy topic, and for Maria, the possibility of renewed US sanctions on the Nord Stream project, which, as we speak, are still on the table before the US Senate. They have not yet voted on those amendments to the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act for 2022. And then what will happen is that we will talk, the three of us amongst ourselves, commenting on each other's presentations insofar as we have reason to do so. And then I will pose questions to kick off the Q&A to both Andreas and Maria, and then the rest of you will by then be encouraged to pose your own questions, or even before then. And Griffin Cotton Cornwall, who will be introduced by Robert Baines later, will be handling that part of the Q&A. So the Nord Stream 2 project has been in the headlines recently and for a number of years. It does not need a great introduction. It's the second line of a gas pipeline that was planned and decided under the chancellorship of Gerhard Schröder of Germany. The first line was built and entered into service. Second line, these are huge pipelines, 55 billion cubic meters per year. The second one has been completed but not been certified and has not entered into service. And these are, dare I say, only two or only one of two pincers that Russian energy policy has sought to apply to Europe. You all know what a pincer movement is in the military sense. It's when it's a double envelopment movement is what it's formally called. The first known occurrence of it was by Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae. And so you all know what that is. Well, if you envision one pincer coming north through the Baltic Sea to northern Germany from the Russian area, from the Russian-Finnish border approximately, and the other pincer coming underneath through the Black Sea into Bulgaria, imagine that they meet somewhere in eastern Austria, where there is a gas hub, very major important gas hub at Baumgarten. And this is a strategy long planned and executed by Russian policy to bite off, as it were, Eastern Europe, East Central Europe, the former Soviet bloc, and the Balkans, to create a sphere of dependence, economic energy dependence, which would translate into political influence. The South Stream pipeline was the first attempt to complement the Nord Stream about 15 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago. It failed because of EU law. It was replaced with the Turk Stream pipeline, and with the purpose of which is simply to, like the Nord Stream pipeline, circumvent Ukraine, which is the major transit country for Russian gas to Europe and to the Central Eastern European countries in particular. That's the general framework. Before I pass the platform to Andreas, I'll just mention, and you can Google this. You can do an image Google while I'm talking for maps if you haven't done already. There is also the Southern Gas Corridor, which is for Europe from the Western Caspian, Azerbaijan, through Georgia, all the way across Turkey to Greece, and under the Adriatic Sea to Italy. But that's a relatively small pipeline and compared with the ones that Russia is managing. So it's a relatively small volume. So with that scene having been set, Andreas Umland, I invite you to fill in some of the details, including the Russian, in those days, Soviet, German energy cooperation dating back to the 1980s and the conflict that caused between the US and Europe at the time, through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline and up to where we are now, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and how German governments have rationalized this and how the Russian government has succeeded in implementing it.
Thank you, Robert. Very glad to be on this panel, and I will here mainly speak about the sort of German perspective. I'm not living in Germany. I live in Kiev actually already for almost 20 years, and but I am German, and I'm sort of following the German debate. And as far as I can see, there are basically three discourses around Nord Stream 2. The first one is about the commercial interests. The second one is about geoeconomic aspects of this project. And a third one is about the geopolitical or security political aspects of this pipeline. And I'm not going to be able to cover here everything. Maybe I'll start with saying something that I often say here in Ukraine when I'm asked about Nord Stream 2, namely that the project, in my opinion at least, is a geopolitical project from the Russian side. But from the German side, it appears, at least to some people, with some justification, I would say, as a commercial project. In Germany, unlike in Russia, business and politics are separate. And the partners on the German side for this project are not mainly state actors, but private companies which have a commercial interest in that. And they are interested in making money, and they are not human rights NGOs. And they also expect from the German government to act on behalf of German companies and not on behalf of foreign actors. And above all, they are expecting not to be influenced by politics. They are claiming that politics and business are separate, and therefore that when they make contracts with a foreign entity, they should not be hindered doing that. This is, I think, one of the lines of argument in this part of discourse. There's also a sort of a side discourse here that is often ignored in Ukraine, which is basically about federalism. And by that, I mean that there are objectively, I would say, East German East German states, in particular Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, that have their own, so to say, state-oriented interest in this project. They are already profiting from the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, and they expect to profit from the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This is infrastructure, these are tax revenues, jobs, and this is good for the region. And again, here the local and the regional actors, they are expecting the federal government of Germany to act on behalf of the interests of these states. And basically what they're saying is to the German chancellor, you are not the chancellor of Ukraine or of Poland, you are the chancellor of Germany. And we have our interests here. We are a federal state, and the federal government is expected to take care internationally of the interests of the federal units, of the Länder, the states of Germany, and in the first place, and geopolitics and the interests of foreign countries come second. That is another sort of side argument here that one often hears, and I think it's very difficult actually to argue against that. That's also why I'm saying here to the many Ukrainian journalists that are interviewing me here is that I would not put too much hope in the next government. The Green Party, of which I'm a member more than 20 years, is against this project. There are also voices in the Liberal Democratic Party, the FDP, as well as in the Christian Democratic Union that are against this project. But I would not put, even though the Green Party is now entering the new government and is even getting the two of the crucial ministries for this issue, namely the Foreign Affairs, the Foreign Ministry and the Economics Ministry. I would not put too much hope in that, because these local German interest groups will remain in place, and they will be demanding from these green ministers and green officials that are now entering the government in the same way they before demanded from the Christian Democratic and Social Democratic ministers to follow German interests and not Ukrainian or Polish or Lithuanian interests. So I think this constellation will remain, and I'm afraid, I hope I'm wrong, but I'm afraid that we should not be expecting a change of course of the German government, in spite of, I would say, the rather encouraging text of the coalition agreement, which deals prominently with Ukraine before Russia, which is very critical of Russia, which explicitly supports Ukrainian territorial integrity and political sovereignty, but which may not lead to a change of the German approach towards Nord Stream 2. And maybe Maria she's close by in Switzerland, she can comment on that and maybe correct me or add something useful. There's then also the already mentioned second geoeconomic debate. I don't feel that competent on this. For that, one needs to really be deep into the economics of energy affairs of Europe, and I don't feel competent on this. I just observe the two sides as they are arguing in this. And even within Germany, there's a rather strong camp, I would say, that even from a geoeconomic point of view is arguing against this. It's basically saying that this is not needed for Germany. It's basically a superfluous project. But then there are other voices which say that this is good for Germany. It makes geoeconomic sense, and we need this gas, and we cannot rely on Ukraine, and all these sort of arguments that one hears. But maybe Maria can also, or you, Robert, can comment on that. What I want to talk here in the few minutes that I've left here is the more paradoxical, I would say, security political argument expressed, for instance, in this statement by the German federal president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, or in general, these sort of pipelines, they are a sort of bridge between Germany and Russia. This is something that connects the two countries. And with saying so, Steinmeier is of course picking up a very old theme in so-called German Ostpolitik, in Eastern policies, which is based on a larger theoretical approach in international relations, namely on interdependence theory, which is basically a very simple theory saying that countries that are economically interdependent with each other do not fight each other. And out of this, you have then a whole, I would say, German foreign policy and foreign economic doctrine under the slogan of Annäherung durch Verflechtung, approximation through entanglement, which seeks to this entanglement, this economic entanglement, which then presumably will lead to political approximation, rapprochement, and that will be good for peace. And in Germany, that's an incredibly important argument, one has to say, because the German political mind, the post-war German political mind, has become pacifist largely, and so much of the foreign policy discourse is also framed in pacifist terms. It's always about how can we promote peace, how can we prevent conflict, how can we end war. And in this frame, now arguments like those that I quoted from Frank-Walter Steinmeier sort of also fit in, that are saying that these pipeline projects that connect Germany with Russia, they are good for peace because they create interdependence, and then Russia is less free to, supposedly less free to act internationally, because it will be then also dependent on the West European market, and all of this will be then good for peace. The problem with this is, however, twofold. First, the empirical record of this approach that goes back into the 1970s, if not before, is ambivalent, to say the least. And the second problem with this is that the entire argument here is not thought through. It's not thought to the end. With the first, I mean that when the first such big German and then Soviet project started in 1970, when basically West Germany and the Soviet Union cooperated in building the gas pipelines that are now connecting Russia with the European Union. Oddly enough, mainly this concerns the Ukrainian gas transportation system that we are also talking here today about. Indeed, this project in the 1970s may have contributed to the phase of detente then. And indeed, this may have been some things that in a way increased German security or even West European security. But the problem here is, of course, that what came after detente, and after detente came, of course, the invasion of Afghanistan, and the enormous, in 1979, and the enormous rise of tensions between the West and the Soviet Union, in spite of this large gas transportation system already being built, having already been built, and in spite of large amounts of gas flowing then from the Soviet Union to Western Europe. So, the theory here does not work quite as easily as it suggests. Also, with the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, we have the problem that this is something that may have increased German security, but it did not increase overall European security. It did not prevent the annexation of Crimea and of the covert intervention in the Donbass. This, which leads me to the second and final point about the interdependence theory and the entanglement ideology, as I would call it, of German foreign policy, namely that this whole theory is not fully applied, actually, to the international affairs of Eastern Europe, in that what is emphasized here is the bridge, as Steinmeier says, between Germany and Russia. But what is not seen herewith is that all of these projects that Robert introduced, Turk Stream, Nord Stream 1, or before South Stream, and now Nord Stream 2, they are not about delivering additional Russian gas to Germany, but they are mainly about changing the transportation lines, the transportation routes from the Ukrainian gas transportation system to the Black Sea and to the Baltic Sea. And so the problem here is that you create bridges, but at the same time, you are destroying a bridge between Ukraine and Russia. So interdependence theory indeed needs to be applied, but it needs to be applied to the entire East European geopolitical situation. It also needs to be applied in particular to the Russian-Ukrainian relations, where the destruction of interdependence with Nord Stream 1 going online, the second string going online in October 2012, you had then a sharp drop in the dependence of Russia on the Ukrainian gas transportation system. And surprise, surprise, in 2013, the tensions are rising between Russia and Ukraine. And the tensions are rising, and that is important to emphasize here, already in 2013. You had, for instance, in August 2013, a 5-day full trade embargo between Russia and Ukraine by Russia. And all that happened when Ukraine still had a rather pro-Russian government, a pro-Russian president and a pro-Russian prime minister, a pro-Russian government. And in spite of a pro-Russian president and government being in power in Ukraine, the tensions were already rising in 2013. These were not yet military tensions, of course, but political, diplomatic, and economic tensions. But this is exactly, in a way, what interdependence theory would predict, that the dependence between Russia and Germany, or the dependence of Russia on the Ukrainian gas transportation system, was declining, and as a result, then the entanglement, the approximation, the political approximation was also declining, and as a result, you have then actually large tensions that eventually then led to the annexation of Crimea. And
right, Andreas, I'm going to let you continue that. I'm going to pose you a question later that will let you continue that thought.
Okay.
But in order to give Maria a chance to intervene, I would pass the floor now to her to discuss the question and the possibility of US sanctions, including, if she wishes, the history of such sanctions.
Thank you, Robert, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you for the third time to discuss this topic. And since we met last time, sanctions continue to be prominently featured in the Nord Stream 2 saga, and they continue to be this underlying story of Nord Stream 2. They have delayed the construction of the pipeline for more than a year and a half, but they still have this persistent risk that is dangling there over Gazprom and Nord Stream 2 again. Since we met last time, I believe in March, there are two main stories which relate to sanctions that I would like to unpack here. The first one is the US-Germany joint statement, which was signed in July this year. The statement was an important milestone for the development of Nord Stream 2 saga, as we know it, because it de facto minimized the risk of extraterritorial sanctions. It was signed by the Biden administration in hope to revive the transatlantic relationship, and particularly with Germany, which were badly shattered under the Trump administration. And since then, even earlier, Biden basically committed himself not to sanction any European or, for that matter, Swiss entity. And we've seen with the latest sanctions, mandatory sanctions that are linked to regularly sanctions packages, only entities and individuals that are targeted are Russian entities. We don't see any German or Swiss entities. And the joint statement also imposes a lot of, includes a lot of important points, but one of which relates to sanctions is that it plainly states that should Russia attempt to use energy as a weapon or commit further aggression against Ukraine, Germany will take action at the national level or press for effective measures at the European level, including sanctions. So this is an interesting statement, especially in light of the ongoing military buildup on the Ukrainian border. And in light of this, it's also indicative that a couple of days ago, American Axios got access to the non-paper issued by the German embassy in the US, which basically urged the Congress not to impose any sanctions on Nord Stream 2, because arguing that it would damage transatlantic unity. There are other arguments which said that Nord Stream 2 at present doesn't represent any threat to Ukraine because of the existing gas contract between Russia and Ukraine, and all sort of similar arguments that we heard over the past 2 years. But it also gave us a little bit more glimpse into what measures Germany would be willing to impose on Russia if something happens. And we should say that there's not much there. At the European level, it has a very vague statement that Germany is participating in the discussion on further restrictive measures against Russia. But as we know, adopting sanctions on the EU level against Russia, in particularly in such a strategic sector as energy, plus given the ongoing soaring prices on the gas market, will be very tricky. On the national level, the measures also feature public pressure, basically raising concerns, as we know it very often from the EU side, political and economic measures, all of them are light, and they actually don't include the measure that was included in the state agreement, which is limiting Russian export capabilities to Europe in the energy sector, including gas or any other economically relevant sectors. So we've seen that the outgoing now German administration still preaches this continuity, that Russia is a reliable energy supplier. And we've seen again this continuity and the refusal to merge the two topics, Nord Stream 2 and Russian behavior, to use Nord Stream 2 as leverage. The outgoing German government continues to compartmentalize these two topics. The second story from the sanctions perspective here is the ongoing tug of war between the Biden administration and the Congress. And this is a war basically that started in May this year over Biden's decision to impose national security waivers. But it's also a tug of war between Congress and the administration as to who will impose and control sanctions. We know that legally this belongs to Congress, but it passed that right to Biden, to administration, who has then more room for maneuver to impose sanctions as a foreign policy tool. So since May, we have Nord Stream 2 has been a block to many nominations in the Biden administration, and actually blocking the nomination of a sanctions coordinator, which would be very important given the ongoing situation on the Ukrainian border. And currently we have two amendments in the National Defense Authorization Act, which are important to impact a little bit further. First one includes mandatory sanctions. Again, as a reaction to Biden's decision to waive those sanctions on Nord Stream 2 AG as an operating company based here in Switzerland, and on its CEO, Matthias Warnig. And this amendment would urge Biden to impose mandatory sanctions on any foreign entity, any foreign individual responsible for planning, construction, and operation of Nord Stream 2. It would also states that any national interest waivers should be rescinded, and also it would constrain the Biden administration in the imposition of any further waivers. So unsurprisingly, we know from foreign policy article that there's been some lobbying going on against this amendment. Secretary Blinken was trying to basically kill this amendment so that Biden administration has this room for maneuver, because as I said earlier, there are these regularly sanctions reports that Biden administration has to sign and to issue, and they should include some entities. So there is there's not so many entities that can be included on those lists. As a result, we've seen over the past week or so that the new amendment was submitted, the so-called Menendez Amendment, and in its scope, it's sort of similar to the previous, the Risch Amendment, and it also says that any foreign entity established for or responsible for the planning, construction, and operation of the pipeline should be sanctioned, plus a successor entity, given the suspended now certification of Nord Stream 2 and the requirement to establish a new entity under the German law. This provision can target anything that Gazprom and the Nord Stream 2 AG will create in the future. But this amendment has an important caveat here, is that it's contingent on Russian escalation. It's also contingent on President Biden to determine whether there is an escalation on the Ukrainian border. So it basically again gives room for maneuver for the Biden administration to decide whether to impose those sanctions or not. As we know, this has been stalled and neither of those amendments have been accepted. So it's still to see and to watch the space in the future, and both amendments likewise would be still contingent on Biden to sign them. Apart from these amendments, we also know that Biden is trying to bring power back to his court yard in terms of signing new executive orders. And there are two new executive orders. One is specifically saying about blocking property on certain Russian energy export pipelines. It doesn't feature Nord Stream 2, but this is definitely, the name is there. And there is another executive order which was signed earlier in April this year, which also says that sanctions against any Russian person, entity involved in cutting or disrupting gas or energy supplies in Europe, the Caucasus, or Asia can be targeted. So there is more going on between the administration and Congress, and this is definitely something to watch, in particularly which amendment will in the end up in the NDAA. And as Andreas indicated, the second aspect here to look for is the new German government. While Nord Stream 2 hasn't been mentioned in the coalition agreement, there is this mysterious cryptic sentence that has been included in the coalition agreement, and it underlines the fact that every German energy project should be compliant with the European energy rules. Now, it's too early to definitely say whether this will be a deal breaker for the new coalition, but it's interesting that this sentence was included. As we know, the coalition agreement was very carefully crafted. There are also no leaks in terms of while the negotiations were going on. So it's fair to say that this could be twisted in a way that we could have predicted before. I agree with Andreas that it's an SPD-led coalition, meaning that a lot of continuity will be there, but it's also interesting to see how the smaller two parties can maybe leverage their position against it. And unsurprisingly, after the coalition agreement was published, Robert Habeck, the future Minister of Economy, spoke again that Nord Stream 2 is not a commercial project and it's a strategic project. So I think there is more to unpack there in the future, and something definitely worth watching in the next couple of months. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Now, as mentioned, and we already have some questions from the audience, and we'll get to them, I promise you, very soon. We encourage more questions. But as I promised the panelists, and I promised you, I have short questions, one for each of them in order to kick off the period. Andreas, it's very interesting for me to hear your skepticism over the political possibility that the new coalition government in Germany will diverge from the political course undertaken under the various Merkel administrations, and indeed before hers. As you may know, in the English language press, at least, a good deal has been made of the opposition and previous declarations even of the new foreign minister concerning the pipeline and concerning gas in general, them being the Green Party and interested in increasing the load of renewables in electricity generation. There was a small phrase that has got a lot of attention in the coalition agreement to the effect that EU law will have its place in the decision by Germany. Maria alluded to this, that it does state that the European energy law, quote, applies to energy politics in Germany, unquote, without mentioning NS2 in particular. Of course, this is merely a reflection of the decision by, I believe it was the European Court of Justice at the end of August, which said this was the case, including unbundling, which I will get to in a moment when I put my question to Maria. So Andreas, kindly, would you explicate further beyond the question of the federalism in Germany, which is at least as complex as it is in the United States, and which is unknown to many specialists in European energy affairs in general. I would ask you to elaborate, if you wish, on that in reference to the present situation, and add also any other thoughts on other topics that may come to you in the meantime.
Well, I mean, to make a prediction here is very difficult, because there's very little one can rely on in terms of similar situations before. This is the first three-party or three-camp coalition that we have. We had earlier only in the Federal Republic two-party or two-camp coalitions. This is a peculiar constellation. Also, the two minor parties, the Greens and the Liberal Democrats, they have taken together gotten more votes than the leading party, the Social Democratic Party. That also creates a sort of an almost, I would say, balance between these minor actors and the party that is providing the chancellor. I think the Green Party, and my impression from Annalena Baerbock, I've never met her personally, but from the way she speaks and so on, that she is pretty, she's pretty hawkish on principles.
Yes, if I may intervene, the other thing that has gotten a high-profile coverage is at least in the Anglophone press again, worldwide, is the more strident and overtly geopolitical stance and perspective of the government of the new government, a coalition, as regards both Russia and China. And so that's just to give a little context to what you were just saying about the change of tone. It's at least of a change of tone toward Russia. Please go ahead.
Yes, and I would even not just limit this here to the influence, what you just mentioned, of the Greens and the Liberals as new governmental parties, but also the SPD is now in the still existing government as well. But even within the Social Democrats, we have in the new Bundestag a change of generation. We have now younger Social Democratic politicians that look differently on Eastern Europe than, let's say, the circle of people around Gerhard Schröder.
That's very important, and it escapes notice.
Yeah. And I think that is also part of the equation here. It's not just that, we have these new parties in the coalition, and that's why the tone changed. But I think it's also a generational change.
Is this generational change, excuse me for interrupting, but I guess we're starting to enter the conversation period, even though I still have a question to put to Maria. Is that generational change characteristic also of either of the two minor parties, the FDP and the Greens?
Yes, but they have been more skeptical of Nord Stream 2 anyway already before. That was clear, and even the older politicians there have been I would say in the liberal among the Liberal Democrats divided, and in the Green Party basically most of the prominent politicians are quite clearly against that. Maybe Maria has also, she's geographically a bit closer to Germany than myself. She has an additional observation to that. But there we have also a change of generation. And for instance, what was quite remarkable, I mean, something that may have perhaps been missing many people in North America is that Robert Habeck, when he went to the Donbass,
Please
he
identify
proposed.
him. Please identify him.
Robert Habeck is the co-chair of the Green Party and will be apparently the new Minister of Economy and Climate in the new government. And he's the sort of also I think now the most popular Green politician in Germany. So he has in a way,
thank you,
perhaps even a larger weight within the Green Party than Baerbock, who was the official candidate for chancellor.
Because the Green has officially 2 co-heads.
Yes. And they have to be from different, there has to be at least one woman among them. So, but anyway, so Habeck went to the Donbass, and under the impression, apparently, of the war there, he made the suggestion that perhaps Germany should also deliver weapons to Ukraine. And that is quite that was an almost revolutionary statement for the German discourse. You would think that, this is the most obvious thing to do, is if this poor country is in trouble, you deliver weapons. But for Germany, that is quite a change. And he got even a lot of critique within his own party for that. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, the general discourse in Germany is very pacifist, and it's in a way not very well made, or it's not a very suitable discourse and foreign political thinking for the kind of conflicts that countries like Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia have.
My last follow-up question for you, Andreas, before I pass to Maria, and I apologize to we have at least 2 questions from the audience now, and we will get to all of them, I promise. But just a little 2 seconds of inside baseball with Andreas. Is it the generational change inside the FDP that brought their new attitude, or did it antedate that? Because I remember that when Willy Brandt began his Ostpolitik in the late 1960s, after leaving the Grand Coalition with the SDP, he made a coalition with the Free Democrats, and it was extremely skillful how the Soviets favored the industrial circles associated with the FDP in order to influence Brandt's Ostpolitik. So when did this change? And I don't know whether that was continued to be the case in the 80s and the 90s, but when did this change in the attitude of the FDP come about toward Russia? Is it only the recent generational change, or did it come before then?
Well, I'm not, as I said, I'm a member of the Green Party, so I know much better what's going on there. In the FDP, well, there was always a wing of the FDP which was about classical liberalism, and which had a human rights agenda, and which has been always been more skeptical of Putin. There's also this business-linked wing, which is, of course, very different, and the FDP
also has a profile in outside of Germany as being, at least it was, I assume it still is, the free enterprise party. In fact, this was one of the issues on which people were skeptical about the Greens being able to cohabit with them.
I was also skeptical, but fortunately they actually made this coalition agreement. But the Greens, the FDP has also been, they had, for instance, I remember in 2007, they had in their electoral program, I think that was the only pro-party that had an explicit statement that Ukraine should get a EU membership perspective. The Greens had it implicitly in their program as well. The SPD and the CDU did not have any statements on that. If I remember, the CSU was the Bavarian party actually was negative. So the FDP was. I'm not sure how much that can be ascribed its position today to generational change.
Okay, no, that's very good. Thank you, because that's very useful, because the sociology of elites and the sociology of political parties and the circulation of elites is a topic that deserves more attention in the popular press, because these are not unitary actors, states or even parties, despite the appearance, one may be misled in Canada sometimes to believe that the head of the party is the party, but this is not the case in the majority of democratic countries. The United States also may be an exception. But where there is a parliamentary democracy as opposed to a presidential or semi-presidential system, that tends to be the case. Maria, you've been very patient. And so I'm going to put to you the question about certification. We're going to have a question from the audience a little later about renewable energy that you also are able to talk about. But I would like to introduce my question to you briefly by saying that amongst the things, the European law that must now be applied to Nord Stream 2 is something called unbundling, which means that Gazprom can't own the pipeline and all the gas that goes through the pipeline at once. It has to share it with other third parties, the throughput. And the idea that's been broached about is, well, Rosneft is going to take up the slack. They're going to sell capacity to Rosneft, which of course is just another Russian company. So as Yuri Vertrenko put it yesterday, I was watching a webinar news from the Brussels Press Club Europa. I said, Russia, instead of taking with one hand, they will take with two hands. Yuri Vertrenko is Ukrainian gas head. So Maria, what about this is something that unfortunately Alan Riley was going to discuss in detail. But insofar, but Maria, you volunteered to discuss questions of certification. So I give you that opportunity now because it governs whether and when the pipeline NS2 will enter into service or not.
Right, this is the main roadblock, and there are two types of certification that we might be talking about. One is technical certification, meaning that it's physically ready to, technically ready to be launched. And this is something that US sanctions also covered in the previous PESA and PESCA sanctions. But the recent announcement from the Danish Energy Agency hinted that the issues of insurance, we know that more than 20 companies withdrew, including main insurance in Zurich and elsewhere, Munich as well. But it seems to be that the issue of insurance has been somehow resolved. This is the technical side of certification, but the certification you're talking about is a regulatory certification, which is something that I think many people are closely watching how it will unfold. And basically it has to, as you said, comply with the three requirements of the EU gas directive. It's unbundling, third-party access, and transparent tariffs. Now, the unbundling is the main hindrance here because politically it would be impossible for Gazprom to do what EU law would require it to do, that you have different companies for transportation and production. So the current certification that is ongoing at the German regulatory agency is to apply for a different type of unbundling. There are three types of unbundling: full ownership unbundling, and then the ITO model, a bit lighter, and ISO even lighter model. So basically under the ITO model, Gazprom is not obliged to sell its ownership rights, but it must give up control and command rights over its leadership. And this is something that Nord Stream 2 AG is applying, that will be the main operator of this. And we know that recently the German regulator agency suspended this certification under the pretext that this subsidiary needs to be done under the German law, not under the Swiss law as currently the case. But just to give the brief overview of certification as such, it takes up to 8-10 months, despite the media trying to float the idea that Nord Stream 2 can be certified in March. I don't see that happening even before the NET suspended it, because even from the timeline, how it unfolds, It takes Venezia 4 months.
Venezia is the German regulator.
Yes, sorry. The German regulator takes 4 months first to review it, and it announced that on 8th of September they had full package of documents. So from this time we have to count this 4 months. Then the European Commission has another 2 months, and it's not a binding opinion, it's sort of a recommendation. At the same time, the EU Energy Directive says that it should be taken with utmost account by the German regulator. The European Commission can also extend this review by another 2 months if it chooses to consult other regulators or other member states. And then we have another 2 months for the German regulator to publish the final decision. And now if we go back to this 4 months of the crucial part of the certification, the main part there has been done by now outgoing German government, where the Ministry of Energy and Climate has submitted this assessment of security risk. And according to the German ministry, there are no security risk of supply, despite the fact that the Polish operator explicitly said that they see security risk there. So there is some politics going on there towards how this was done and to what extent Polish objections were taken into account. So overall, that leaves us that as a time frame, the certification could last until May, July. Now with the suspension, this is another big uncertainty question mark, how long it will take Nord Stream 2 AG to create a new subsidiary under the German law, and to transfer the main assets and human resources towards this new subsidiary. This is something the German regulator required in its press announcement a couple of weeks ago. And experts argue that could take 2 months or maybe half a year. So with this timeline, we won't see the launch of Nord Stream 2, to September, definitely, if not longer.
Okay, thank you, Maria. We're coming up on the 1 hour mark, which is a good time to jump to the audience questions. And I understand that there are at least 2 audience questions, and that Griffin Cornwall, who Robert Baines is about to introduce as soon as I give him the word, passer la parole, that Griffin also has 2 questions of his own, one for each of the panelists, and that will wind up the session unless another audience question comes in, and we will deal with that. So Robert Baines, I hand the floor back to you to introduce to the audience Griffin.
Thank you, Robert. It's my pleasure to do so. Griffin Cornwall has been a research analyst at the NATO Association, and specifically helping to manage the energy security program for us under Dr. Cutler for, I guess, the past 1.5 years now, Griffin. And he's done a terrific job.
Yes, he has.
Educated at the University of Alberta, and then did an MA at the University of Toronto in their Ceres department, so dealing a lot with Eastern Europe, obviously there. And we're thrilled to have him. Griffin, what kind of questions do we have here today from you two?
All right. So the first question is whether or not, and these are open questions. So the first question is whether or not the panelists foresee hydrocarbon energy decreasing in geopolitical importance as Europe shifts to green and renewable energy sources.
That's a toss-up. I know that Maria is able to speak to the question of the eventuality of export of renewable energy from so-called renewable sources from Ukraine to the EU. I'll first give Andreas a chance, because I don't know whether that falls into his basket or not. He's sort of nodding, probably not, but I will also chime in on all of the questions if I have something to say, but I want to give the panelists the chance first. And I know Maria can talk about renewables, and she would have in her main presentation, only we agreed there was not time. So Maria, do you want to take a crack at that, at least insofar as renewable export to Ukraine is? I don't know whether you want to deal with the continent-wide question.
Yes, I think it's a very important question of a long-term prospects, how renewables will reshape geopolitics, not just energy flows, because the recent regulations under the EU CBAM and all Green Deals regulations will definitely shape energy flows as we know it. So. Gas is something that might be considered as a bridge for the next decade or two, and from the Russians' perspective, it's definitely in its interest to prolong it, to capitalize as long as possible on the fuel on which its budget largely depends and its GDP. At the same time, both Russia and Ukraine have woken up to this new challenge, how to restructure its economy. From Ukraine's point of view, dependency on transit fees, from Russia's point of view, export of hydrocarbons. And here both countries are adapting. And to me, the main question is whether we'll see the same replication of geopolitics in renewables as we see it with gas flows. So just to briefly cover both countries, Russia has actually adapted a hydrogen strategy. It's been faster. It's been quite slow in waking up and acknowledging this threat, and I think some even Russian analysts are talking about an energy revolution in Russia that had finally sunk in the threats of what it would mean for revenues for the Russian budget. And even Igor Sechin said that the impact of CBAM and Green Deal regulation will be much more devastating for Russia than the impact of Western sanctions. So this acknowledgement is there. But it's also important to know that there is this consolidated governmental approach on how to deal with this, how to tackle this problem. And it's very top-down, as is always the case in Russia, and we have already strategies, it also on the government level, but also on the level of companies. Both Gazprom, Rosneft, and Novatek are already switching to new low carbon fuels. For example, Novatek, I think, abandoned even one of its LNG plants and will produce ammonia, something that will be of very high demand in a couple of decades.
It's already, if I may jump in, it's already going to be in very high demand because ammonia is necessary for the production of fertilizer. And this is already a commodity that is scarce and which is reflected in part in the inflation in food prices.
Yeah. To switch to Ukraine, it also, to its credit, is not lagging behind, and there has been a lot of discussions this year together with World Bank. Kiev is trying to also produce its hydrogen strategy. As I understand, it's been delayed till spring next year. But also on the governmental level, we see a lot of movements. There is a hydrogen council that's been established to lobby for this type of fuel. Companies have been relatively active on this front as well. At the same time, this lack of regulatory framework might be decisive for Ukraine, despite the fact that it's been explicitly mentioned now in the EU regulations that part of green hydrogen will come from Ukraine. Now the coalition agreement in Germany specifically mentions Ukraine. So in terms of regulatory framework, Ukraine's been mentioned quite a few times. At the same time, it shouldn't be seen as an indicator that all of this will come to Ukraine automatically. The framework should be done as a starting point to attract investments, because it's a capital intensive area, and without investments, that will be very hard to kick off. And government should provide some framework for that. So this is something definitely worth watching, how two countries will adapt to this, and whether, as I said, we'll see some sort of replication of geopolitical tensions again.
Thank you, Maria. I neglected to say in the beginning, but as should be self-evident, that all of the views that are presented here are the views of the individual presenting them and do not reflect the views of any organization with which they are affiliated. This applies also to the views that I'm about to exposit. And Andreas, you hesitated before. You will be welcome to comment. I will say, because what I have to say involves partly Germany, you are free to say something or to say nothing anytime before, during, or after. Is that the question? I'm a textual person, and the question was, do I foresee hydrocarbon energy increasing in geopolitical importance? The answer I would offer is that it will remain at least as geopolitically important as it is today, notwithstanding the likely rhetorical shift away from it. I'd like to underline that. If one looks at the baseline EU projection for energy consumption into the future, one is struck by the fact that the absolute quantities of hydrocarbon, by which is meant oil and gas, even though I open a parenthesis, coal is technically hydrocarbon also, because it's carbon and hydrogen and some impurities, close that parenthesis. But the term is used to refer to oil and gas, and I use it that way here, that this that the EU projections themselves do not foresee a significant decrease, do not realistically foresee a significant decrease. I'm talking about the old projection to 2040, not the new ones to 2055. In consumption, and of course, if the total energy consumption increases and hydrocarbons remain the same quantity, then of course their percentage will decline somewhat, but the absolute quantities will stay the same. And also, what must be remembered is that oil and gas do things that nothing else can do, including provide base load capacity for when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, as is being discovered as we speak in Sweden and the UK and other countries in Europe, as we have the second La Nina winter in a row. And that indeed oil and gas are required, oil and coal are required for the production of wind turbines. They're required for the production of solar panels. And this is one reason why the energy companies with a traditional profile in oil and gas are very much in favor of solar and wind, not only because they can produce that and get into that subsector of the energy sector, but also these things cannot be mined. The minerals required to produce the wind turbines and the solar cells cannot be mined, refined, transported, transformed, or maintained in place once they are installed without significant amounts of oil and gas. This is, therefore, I would answer the question to say that the geopolitical importance of hydrocarbon energy will not decrease even as the rhetorical field shifts away from it and stylizes its discussion of hydrocarbon energy. Now, there's one other point I would like to make in this connection, and this is where Andreas may or may not choose to make a comment, is that why has there been a push, especially in Europe, toward so-called renewable resources, by which are meant principally solar and wind energy. I submit to you that this is the new German industrial strategy. What do I mean by that? German industrial strategy used to focus on good old German industry, the way that we used to know it, Siemens and other serious, hard capital goods companies. However, when all these German companies sought to enter the Chinese market, they were compelled by Chinese law and by Chinese negotiating to sign contracts which compelled them to turn over to the Chinese government their own proprietary technology in order to enter the Chinese market. What's the result of this? Well, the archetypical result is that who do you think is building the railroads in Southeast Asia now? No, it's not Siemens, it's China, with technology that Siemens signed over to them, with lower costs of labor, lower standards for environmental security, and so on. And that these, this is, I took the example of Siemens, but there's a whole slew of companies that can be named in numerous industrial sectors where Germany was the world leader and is no more because these technologies were contractually signed over to China, which tinkers with them and improves them indeed. So I submit, and I have very good reason to believe. I'll put it this. Let me say that I have very good reason to believe that this is the new industrial strategy. That the German government, the German state, not the government, because it's across governments. The German state has used the EU to subsidize German research and development, not only German, but a lot of German research and development into these technologies for renewable energy, which now, in addition to the last 300 billion euros, in addition, that was announced within the last week, also will go to encouraging the purchase of German-produced, whether in Germany or elsewhere, such technologies by countries, not only in the EU, but worldwide. How worldwide? Because of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement puts what we used to call developing countries, third world countries, in a position, and these are by their own words, that either they accept loans for the development and purchase of renewable technologies, or they don't get anything at all. The World Bank, and I believe also the European Investment Bank, have said they will no longer provide loans for traditional hydrocarbon development. So I submit that this is a seldom noted, but extremely important part of the puzzle that goes to explain why there has been the shift. Now, there is a lot of political, sociological matters. I won't get into the recently concluded conference, COP26 Glasgow. It's beyond our scope. But I simply wish, since we're talking about hydrocarbons and NS2, Nord Stream 2, and we're talking about German politics, I just simply want to mention that in the context of my reply to the question, do I foresee hydrocarbon energy decreasing in geopolitical importance as Europe shifts to green energy sources? And that's my answer to that question. Now that I've set the cat amongst the pigeons, I'll let either of the panelists reply to my comments, or we will move on to Griffin's second question that he found from the audience. But first, I give Andreas in particular a chance, if he wishes, I give him the chance to choose whether or not to comment and to make any comment if he chooses, because he is much more knowledgeable about German politics than I am.
You reproduced, in a way, much of the arguments in Germany that have been made with the energy transition and about Nord Stream 2. And there's, for instance, one, just to comment on this issue now, there's one sort of strategic discussion now in Germany where people, I think, are genuinely worried by climate change, whether Germany should rather become an example for other countries and become a green country, and then to set this example and to hope that other countries will follow Germany.
Yes, that's
Or
that's a long-standing discourse in Germany, is it not?
Yeah, and then there's now another strategy that is being discussed in the Green Party, especially among the liberals, but also among the Christian Democrats, that what Germany should really do is what you just indicated. It should develop new green technologies and then export these technologies. And that is the way to prevent climate change. And that is actually Germany's mission, so to say. To use its engineering experience to provide the world. I mean, that sounds maybe a little bit pathetic with the technologies to prevent climate change, and that is actually slightly different from limiting your own industry in terms of producing CO2, the gas, the climate changing gas. But I want to get back to Nord Stream 2. I mean, this is also a popular topic in Germany, that when we actually need gas, and and all the predictions are saying that the demand is not going down, perhaps even going up. But that is, of course, somewhat misleading discussion, because Nord Stream 2 is not about gas, but it's about transportation routes. And there is already now overcapacity for transporting gas. Then there is a discussion that allegedly, maybe Maria can comment on this, that allegedly the gas transportation via the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea is much cheaper than through the overland pipelines, Yamal and the Ukrainian gas transportation system, and that's therefore a good deal, so to say. But my interpretation here is that these projects in the Baltic and Black Sea, they are geopolitical. They are, as they are what you mentioned at the very beginning. Designed to get Ukraine out of this business and then to give Putin a free hand. Another motivation here, by the way, for Russia maybe is to make the Ukrainian gas transportation system financially unviable and also technologically more difficult to run. That has been an argument made by Margarita Balmaceda. If it does not fulfill anymore its transit function. So it has actually two functions. It transports gas from Russia to the EU, but it's also transporting gas within Ukraine to households and to industrial companies. And if you don't have the transit anymore, then it will be both financially and technologically more difficult to run the internal Ukrainian gas transportation. And so that this may be another motivation for Russia actually to exclude Ukraine from the transit business.
Yes, Andreas, you made 2 or 3 points that I wish to underline so they don't get lost in your honestly very knowledgeable and to the point discussion, is that the gas through Nord Stream 2 would not be consumed in Germany. It would be consumed in the Central East European countries that used to be part of the Soviet bloc. That's the first. In fact, someone once asked me 10, 15, 12 years ago, what's in it for Germany, the Nord Stream 2? Well, Germany becomes the monopolistic distributor of Russian gas in Europe, is what happens. And that we see underway. It's too bad that Agatha is not with us, because I would have asked her about the Baltic Pipe, which goes from just completed, which will satisfy Poland's energy needs, but for 10 billion cubic meters per year, from Norway through Denmark to the Polish coast. But I don't believe any of that would follow on to any of the other East European countries. I believe the 10 billion cubic meters is for Poland because that's what they need. The second point you mentioned, Andreas, that I would wish to underline is that it's not only that the Russian diminution of flow of Russian gas would make maintenance more difficult for the Ukrainian gas transport system. The fact is, with such gas transport systems, if you don't have gas running through it, it collapses and you can never use it again. In fact, there was Putin made one of his Putinesque jokes just the other day, 10 to 15 days ago, which I'm sure you'll recall. And I'll make the connection because a lot of people probably, you caught it, I'm sure, but he said that the Ukrainian gas transport system is in such poor shape, it could collapse, it could blow up. These were his literal words. It could blow up at any moment. Well, myself, having spent such a long time on Caspian Sea energy and the South Caucasus, Central Asia, I immediately made the connection to the explosion in the Turkmenistan pipeline in 2009 which went to Russia, and which Russia blamed on poor Turkmen engineering, and which Turkmenistan blamed on Russia. And it turned out in the end to be the fact that in order to shut down a pipeline, you can't do it all at once. You have to do it gradually, or else things will literally blow up. The pipeline exploded from excessive pressure. And for this pipeline from Turkmenistan to Russia, you need 2.5 to 3 days to do it correctly. Well, the Russians gave the Turkmens 1 day of advance notice that they were shutting it down. Lo and behold, it blew up. And the reason why they did was that Gazprom, which was the purchaser on the Russian end, had what's called, it's a normal thing in the industry, a take or pay contract, which means either you receive the gas and you pay for it, or you don't receive it and you pay for it if you have too much gas already. And what the induced explosion of the Turkmenistan pipeline enabled them to do is declare force majeure, act of God, and then invoke that clause of the contract, which meant they did not have to indemnify Turkmenistan, and they did not have to pay for the gas that they did not receive because it was beyond their control. So this is the immediate subtext I read to Putin's laughing joke about, well, the Ukrainian pipeline system is so decrepit it could blow up at any moment. So I just mentioned that in terms of the condition of the Ukrainian pipeline. If you don't have gas flowing through a gas transit system, it will collapse and you will not be able to use it again. I think that it's time to, unless Maria wants to chime in, Andreas, you mentioned something. Maria, do you have anything to jump in on there, or we go to the second question from the audience?
Just to briefly, well, it's no surprise that Russia wants to circumvent Ukraine. I think it also poses a good opportunity. There is a silver lining maybe in all of this, is that gas will be phased out in a couple of decades. So this might be an opportunity for Ukraine to also be less dependent on gas transit fees, which will be phased out sooner or later, and to adapt this infrastructure. And as you rightly said, that with the reduced amount of gas going through the Ukrainian infrastructure, there are many threats here and there in terms of capacity and maintenance of the infrastructure, but it could also represent an opportunity to test hydrogen, because Ukraine has a very vast infrastructure that could design, repurpose for the export of green hydrogen. And this leads us back to this joint statement that has this third part on the Green Fund, which Germany and the US now committed to refill up to $1 billion. This is a big still question mark who will be investing there. But this brings us back to Andreas' point on technology, because technology is something that Germany can supply to Ukraine and to Russia. So Russia will also can be potentially a buyer of this advanced German technology for hydrogen, for carbon capture and storage, and so on. So technology will be very important for this energy transition. And we know that there are negotiations between Ukraine and Germany, but also between Russia and Germany, how to adapt to this and which technology can be sourced to that. So there is a small silver lining in all of this.
Okay, well, thank you, Maria. Before I give the floor back to Griffin for the second question from the audience, I would like to add underline one thing that you said and add a clarification. You mentioned gas being phased out, and this rejoins the original question of the in my view, continuing geopolitical importance of gas and oil. One, and this is a very important thing, that point that is not well understood by the general public, and even by and even by politicians, is that when one speaks about gas being phased out, for example, or when one hears that 70% of the energy was furnished by renewable technologies this weekend when the sun was shining and there were no factories open, it's not 70% of all the energy. It's 70% of all the electricity. Electricity represents only between 25 and 30% of all energy consumption on the average across the world. And in any particular country. It's gone up a little bit in the EU over the last 5 years from roughly 26 to roughly 29%. But this is another reason to rejoin the question why I maintain that the hydrocarbon energy will not go away, because if wind and solar, nuclear is another question, could be used for the other 70% of the energy that's not the electricity generation, it would be, but it can't be, so it won't be. So something else needs to be used. So, thank you. Now, Griffin, you have a second question from the audience, I believe.
Yes, the next question from the audience, and this is again another open question, is whether you envisage a rift between France and other European powers on energy policy, especially given France's the importance France places on nuclear power in contrast to other much more nuclear wary powers such as Germany.
Maria, as Andreas has said several times, you are based in Switzerland. You have a closer view of these things than anyone else here. Would you like to hazard, although I recognize that it's not an issue that you do your research on and publish, unless I'm mistaken, because sanctions keep you pretty busy. Would you like to take a whack, as we say in American colloquial slang, at that question?
It's hard for me to come up with a cogent answer immediately, because as you say, this is not something I cover per se. I usually look at this through sanctions perspective or Ukraine.
Fair enough. Andreas, I don't know whether it's something that you look at closely either, but do you want to try, or do you want to pass?
I'm not an expert on this particular issue, but traditionally Germany and France have been cooperating closely. I would expect this to continue. There is, however, I rather want to comment on this than on the nuclear issue here, a problem in the sort of policies of the European Union towards Eastern Europe, where France usually is much more hesitant to go ahead. than Germany even, and especially than the East European member states of the European Union. That has been a constant theme, as far as I hear also from diplomats, that France has other geopolitical interests, is less engaged in Eastern Europe, less interested also than Germany in Eastern Europe. And that may be, if now under the new government, there may be a new round of engagement of Germany in Eastern Europe, then that may be something where we may have some sort of tension between Germany and France. But indeed, there is also a diverging philosophy about energy between the two countries. Germany is not only going to phase out coal, but also nuclear energy. And other countries in Europe are, on the contrary, they see nuclear as a solution rather than as a problem. But again, I'm not competent enough to comment more on this.
Well, I'll throw in my 2 cents. From the standpoint of, this is really a question about intra-EU balances of interests. And it goes beyond the question of nuclear power and beyond the question of energy. I would note, and perhaps the person asking the question had this in mind, that just some days ago, France and Italy signed a bilateral treaty. Imagine 2 members of the European community signing a bilateral treaty in which they will enhance cooperation, and this on the heels of Angela Merkel's exit from the chancellorship. It foretokens a changing balance or a wish on the part of France, no doubt, as well as Italy, to alter the balance of interests. I won't call it a balance of power because it's not a balance of power. I'll call it a balance of interests within the EU on numerous issues which go beyond that, and these are all also subject to electoral vagaries. The German coalition government will take its own path. I believe that the question of nuclear power will come, well, it's already been rife with discussion in the corridors and the salons, not salons, the meeting rooms of Brussels, as to what will the EU allow itself to subsidize. Well, not gas. Well, then they change their mind. Well, green hydrogen, which means hydrogen from electrolysis, from separating hydrogen and oxygen in water, separating it using energy from offshore wind turbines. Then, well, we'll allow blue gas. Blue gas is gas that is created from methane, CH3 carbon, which used to be called, which I still call, which many people still call natural gas, but which is often now stigmatized, especially in the EU discourse, as fossil gas. It's the same thing. So there's a new balance of interests arriving in the EU, especially with things going far beyond the scope of this session. The question of Poland, Agatha could have spoken to that because she's based in Warsaw. But the question was a rift between France and other European powers on energy policy. No, between France and Germany, perhaps to some degree, but France will continue to play balances against Germany. It will continue to make nuclear power as palatable as possible, including in those countries outside the EU, subject to the self-reporting required of them by the Paris Agreement and so on. Well, That's the end of the second question, but I know that Griffin has been very patient because I know that he has two questions of his own, very symmetrically balanced, one for Maria and one for Andreas. So Griffin, which one do you want to ask first, to which panelist? And then there will be further discussion of the panel a little bit. And whenever we finish up, and if there are no further questions from the audience, then I'll hand the platform back to Robert Baines, and he'll hand it back to me, and I'll say goodbye. So Griffin, what are your questions? And for whom? One at a time.
Okay, one at a time. All right. I was going to ask whether I should ask them one at a time or both together.
Well, I mentioned to you that one of them should be directed to Maria and the other one should be directed toward Andreas. So I think, ask one question to one person, we'll exhaust that discussion and then move to the second question.
Okay. So the first question, I'll start with the one you recommended for Dr. Shagila.
Which only means that she has the first opportunity to answer, and then everyone else can chime in, because this question is proper to your field of expertise.
Yes. So the first question was, will the incoming German government's policy goal of having 80% of the country's electricity supply being generated by renewable sources have an impact on the chances for Nord Stream 2's final approval?
I suggested that being directed toward you, Maria, because of what you have already said about Ukraine's possible participation in the furnishing of such energy, renewable energy, to the EU. Maria? I think I must have interrupted things too much. The question was, you do hear me, Maria? Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, I think she must
Yes.
just be otherwise cut out. So
okay, well then we'll put the second question to Andreas and come back to the first one as a toss-up.
Okay. So the second question was whether the ongoing tensions between Europe, Belarus, and by extension Russia, whether they could create pressure for one side or the other to get the Nord Stream pipeline approved, especially in light of President Lukashenko's recent threats to close down the pipelines crossing Belarusian territory, and President Putin's stance that such a shutdown would benefit no one.
Well, everything is connected with everything. We have now many things going on at the same time, and it's difficult to say what plays in which direction. So, one interpretation could be that these situation at the gas market, the rising tensions should be a factor that will speed up the operation of Nord Stream 2. Another interpretation is that, on the contrary, that Russia's behavior in the last weeks is actually something that is creating an image problem for Russia. I would rather stick to the outline that Maria has given about the certification process, that simply the whole procedure that I got the impression already before listening to Maria, but now also outlined once more to Maria, is very bureaucratized. So my impression is that the political factors are not going to play such a big role, and the major sort of outside political factor that can play still here a role, I would say, is the US, and how the US discourse and how the relationship between the White House and Congress develops. And that again can be influenced by Russia's behavior and even by Lukashenko's behavior, perhaps. But I don't think it has really that much direct connection here to the issues we are talking about. About the German government's aim, I mean, that is the sort of the big counter argument against Nord Stream 2, that it's a project that is out of tune with the general direction of German policies, that it's sort of that the German energy policies are going in another direction. But again, I'm not competent enough here to evaluate this. I call this the geoeconomic discourse, whether indeed Germany may not need pipelines, gas pipelines, or that many gas pipelines in the future, and that indeed Nord Stream 2 would be entirely superfluous, and perhaps even some of those pipelines that are now being used are going to be out of business. That is something I can't say.
All right.
I also have to leave. I have another session soon here.
That's okay. We're just going to wrap it up, Andreas. Thank you for being here so much. And I'm going to close the session actually now because we are almost at the 1 3/4 mark, which is where we usually cut it. And just to thank both of you for being here. It's unfortunate that literally within the last 24 hours, the other two panelists had family medical emergencies that prevented them from being here, but I'm certain that Nord Stream 2 pipeline is a topic we will return to next year. And we look forward to reuniting the four of you. This is for all four of you. This is or would have been repeat appearances on a webinar here. And so we're glad to have you as part of our extended family, and look forward to continuing this discussion in the future as events warrant it. With that, I hand the parole back to Robert Baines to close things up.
And thank you, Robert, for your role. It's been wonderful to have you steer us through this again. And Griffin, thanks for adding those questions in. I really do love this discussion because it just reminds us how intricate everything is. Andreas, as you were saying, everything is connected to everything. Well, the whole point of NATO is to try to bring people together above differences. But you realize just how challenging that is because of all the interests at play. That's obviously going to be a push and pull dynamic, bring people together, but then also to deal with all of the legitimate, very often differences we have about what to do on our security, and in this case is energy security. So the more we talk about this and at the same time recognize that we have to deal with these problems and have an idea of unity as one of the greatest attributes and inheritances we have from the Second World War. What we learned from that is that we must not be divided in a way that endangers our own security. So I hope that gave us a little bit of an understanding of the complexities at play here. There are so many, and I really appreciate everybody contributing and to those who are watching. If you'd like to stay involved in our community, we do have significant international platforms, of course, through social media. Please do connect with us, consider joining us as a member, and of course, following us on YouTube. With that, Robert, any last words?
No, I have no last words. Anything I might say would be superfluous to your own.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, everybody, and I hope to see you all again soon.
Except to join myself with your thanks to the panelists who came through so marvelously under unexpected circumstances.
Well met. Well, have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.